from the pretentious world of post-secondary education, where where if you, I told that story last week, getting a doctorate, if you're a doctoral student, you were like the lowest form of life on the food chain. And so being surrounded by people who made me feel that way all the time, it was kind of a humbling experience to go back with the reality of high school kids. And the two classes they gave me were, because I was spent most of my day doing administrative stuff, but I was glad to teach because what I was used to teaching, gave me a class of 9th graders, and I don't think there was anybody in the class who was over the 40th percentile in terms of IQ. And so it was Kennedy High School, and they actually did miracles with some of those kids, but I was supposed to teach them the wisdom books of the Old Testament. I mean, I still don't understand the wisdom books of the Old Testament, and I was supposed to teach them to these 9th graders. So they gave me this textbook, and I thought most college students could read this textbook, much less these 9th graders. And so I just made up a project which took almost the whole semester. I told them I was going to teach them about the 10 Commandments. And so 10 Commandments appear a couple different places in the Old Testament, so I thought, well, at least I'm covering the material. But what I had the kids do, most of them were better at drawing than writing. And so I had them draw pictures of what it took to keep a commandment or break a commandment. And then, this was a multi-step process. There's a fancy educator term for this kind of project. I don't know what it is, but it was, they had them. And so I said, you got to draw a picture, keep the first commandment, break the first commandment. But I said, you're making these pictures for our 2nd graders. And so they did it. And some of them got pretty good at it, at making those pictures. We'd work on that day after day. And then after we finally got it down to where I thought they were decent enough pictures, I said, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into coloring books for our 2nd graders. But then I told them, here's the Catholic way. Before you do any good project, you have to have the money to do the project. I said, I don't have money to burn. I know the school would have paid for it, but I was trying to teach them a lesson. So they had to go out and do fundraisers to raise the money to print these books. So they did car washes and bake sales, and it was something they could do. And then in the end, I don't really know if we raised enough money for the books or not. That wasn't the point. But we printed the books, and then we got enough books for all the 2nd graders in that area. And then we arranged times when these kids could go deliver these books to the 2nd graders in the area. And I thought that was the best use of my time I could come up with. It made way more sense than asking them to memorize passages from the Book of Wisdom, which they were never going to remember anyway, or wouldn't even understand what they meant. So that was it kind of gave me, it was a nice link between pretentious university lifestyle and being back in the classroom. And then they gave me a class of seniors. And these seniors probably had some of the most extreme cases of senioritis of anybody I ever know. And they were mostly children from privileged families, and they had money to burn and not a lot of responsibility. So that was another whole different set of issues. So that's where I followed my basic principles I always did with kids. I only had 3 rules for teaching. Same 3 rules I have for parents, even though I never raised any. Unconditional love, clear boundaries, consistent enforcement. Well, some of these kids weren't used to any of those 3 things. So they got them from me, and they learned that unconditional love didn't mean you always agreed with the kid. And so it worked out good. We came to understandings, let's put it that way. And so I enjoyed the senioritis experience there also while I was teaching. I thought Kennedy High School did take a lot of children of lower ability, but it also took a lot of these kids who got kicked out of the fancier schools where they were paying 3 times the tuition, but these schools really weren't doing a very good job with them, and I think Kennedy did a good job with a lot of these kids. And at this particular time in history, by the history of that school, is when it was built, it was supposed to be staffed partially by Christian brothers and partially by Ursuline sisters. They both had schools in that area. But then what happened was, in the 70s, there was a massive leaving of religious communities. And so there weren't enough leftover brothers and sisters to staff that school. So they staffed it mostly with lay people who were drawn from other schools. So it was a real challenge for the school in its history. And so, yeah, and you think about what was going on in that era, 1983, the presidents during the 90s were Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and that was coming out of the tumultuous years of the 1960s and 1970s and all the social upheaval. Well, the social upheaval remained in terms of influencing society, and these children were beneficiaries of what had happened a lot in the 60s and 70s, was the way the sex culture had changed, the drug culture, and what was going on with family life. A lot of that was not pretty. John Paul II had been elected Pope, but he was only a Pope a few years by that time. And so that was, there was a lot of tumultuous activity in the church at that time too. And that was just at the very beginning of beginning to settle down in his early days as Pope. And then during those same 7 years I'm talking about tonight, that's when the Berlin Wall fell, which was a great thing. So that was the Cold War in some senses was over, but we were into a new chapter of history, but nobody was too sure what that new chapter was yet. Roe v. Wade had been passed in 1973, so we were already 10 years into that, and not much had been done in society in terms of a pro-life movement yet. There really wasn't much of one in the 80s, because I think everybody thought that was such a bad law, it was going to eventually be overturned. Well, 10, 15 years later it wasn't, but yet the outflow from that continued. It was also a changing time in terms of, as I said, in terms of number of religious. Back in its peak, our diocese had 69 communities of women, 31 of men, and it was pretty clear even by the 80s when the massive numbers leaving the community started in the 60s and 70s, that the schools weren't going to have the future of the Catholic schools was going to be mostly lay teachers. So it was a lot to adjust to. And then after that, I moved up to North County. I was moved by the bishop to North County. Our Lady of Good Counsel Parish in Bellefontaine Neighbors, taught at Rosary High School for 2 years. One of the people that I hired there for his first teaching job is here tonight, I see. And so, and I was still teaching in the graduate school at SLU. I did that for years. Probably the most notable thing about the staying there at Lady of Good Counsel Parish was the pastor. He was a very memorable person. His name was Carl Pelker. His brother John was the mayor of St. Louis. He came from a very well-connected family. Very highly accomplished family. Each of his brothers was a professional person of some prominence. He ran that place with an iron fist, but also with a great deal of love. I grew to respect what he stood for. He showed me there, in a way, what my life has become, and that his roots were in North St. Louis, working in a Italian parish. And by that time, this is when there was a massive numbers of people who grew up in North St. Louis leaving to go to the county, and that particular parish was about half people descendants of Polish immigrants and about half of Italian immigrants. They naturally didn't get along that great, so they couldn't have one festival, so they alternated 1 year an Italian festival, 1 year a Polish festival. But with him, those of you who are here from our parish, you think I keep a tight control on things. You know, one thing is here, but I don't have very many keys. I only got keys to a few places. The church, my office, my house, and my car. Everybody, behind every other door, somebody else is supposed to be in charge of it. And so that's the way that I do things. But there, Monsignor Pelker had a key that worked for everything. He had every key matched to his master key. And to the point, while I was there, he contracted, he was pretty well advanced in years, but he was diagnosed with cancer and he died during the years I was there. But the best example I can give you as to what a tight control he had, how people went to him for everything. Here, it's just the opposite. People go to me for hardly nothing. They go to somebody else who can actually know how to do something. And so the only thing they come to me for is spiritual things or if they have a complaint. And so they have, but when he was literally dying in the hospital and they ran out of toilet paper in the women's bathroom over in church, somebody called him at the hospital. This is pre-cell phone days. And so he was at Christian Northeast Hospital, so somebody called him and said, Monsignor, we're out of toilet paper in the women's bathroom. And he actually didn't mind. It was like that was the way he ran the parish. He would make sure that they got right on that and get that filled. Let's just say he kept a close eye on things. Well, one tender story I will tell about him, he was of the kind, the very old school. I remember when I was a kid, if you had a rosary, a Catholic school kid, and you put it around your neck, you would have been reprimanded pretty severely, depending upon how severely by how the teacher was. And he was kind of from that same generation that would not have thought that was very respectful. But I came home one day from Rosary, as I usually spent the day there, and came to the parish in the evening. I was going to have dinner with him, and the young man there who was his caretaker, his hospice worker, by that time he was pretty much being wheeled around in a wheelchair. His hospice worker was a young man who was not cut from the same cloth as Monsignor Pelker. He had long hair and earrings and tattoos, which isn't a big deal today, but back in the 80s, that was a big deal. And he was wearing a rosary around his neck. But this backstory is Monsignor gave him that rosary. It was my point is he was witnessing the faith and teaching to the end. This young man had no acquaintance with any faith. And that was his way of teaching them, was he taught them how to pray the rosary. And so I can guarantee you in his younger day, I knew Monsignor Pelker was not going to let a kid get away with that. It would have been considered disrespectful. So and Monsignor treated me great. It happened to me wherever I went, people treated me good. I don't know why, but it's worked out pretty good. And so we'll have, with him, I told one of his brothers one day, I said, wow, I said, Monsignor sure is nice to those kids. And he says, well, you are seeing Monsignor in the green wood. He said, you didn't see him when it was in the dry wood. I said, well, I'm glad. It's just the green wood years look pretty good. So my point is he was very generous and dedicated to his faith and worked as long as he could, as hard as he could until the end of his days. A big surprise happened one day when I came home from school, though, when he did die, and they were doing the wake right there. It was kind of traditional to do it the center aisle in the church where he was pastor. And I come in from school and look at him, and usually the tradition is you put a vestment on a priest. Well, they had my favorite vestment on Monsignor in the casket. And it didn't really matter to me too much. I was just startled at first, and I'm glad it wasn't me in the casket, but it was him. I actually took that as because I don't really have anything very fancy, as most of you know me, to this day. And so the fact that they thought the best vestment we had was one of my vestments, and it was pretty typical of the parish that nobody asked. People just did pretty much what they wanted to do. And so I was good with that. And so I know my favorite vestment from that age is over there in Calvary Cemetery. It probably doesn't look the same way as it did the day that he was buried, but I thought Monsignor took a little bit of me along with him into the grave. So when I was at Rosary High School there, I learned a lot of lessons there. One thing I learned was to run the day on schedule. I was kind of from the 60s and 70s generations. Things were a little casual in a lot of ways. Well, I learned in high school that it's not weird that a class begins at 2:17, it ends at 2:59, and it can't be a minute earlier or a minute later. It would seem like a strange world to me, but that's the way that it was. Well, I learned the first time we were having a Mass. I thought I was all excited about organizing this Mass, and I thought it was one of the best Masses ever because I had organized it. And I get back to the office after Mass was over, and I was getting glares from all the other administrators because it's like, this Mass went way too long. And so all the teachers were going to be mad because their schedules were disrupted for the rest of the day. Say they had to redo the whole schedule. And in those days, it was still like a manual bell system. So imagine what it took to rearrange all those bells. So I learned high schools run on time. Okay, so it was just a new lesson. I also remember, even if you're trying to say something kind, make sure you got a lot to back it up. Well, I was just making some gratuitous remark someday to one of the teachers who had been there for a long time. And I said, boy, I hear there's been a lot of good things going on here in this school over the years, which I had heard in a very general kind of a way, but I couldn't cite chapter and verse. But this was a very unhappy teacher. And she said, well, like what? And I really couldn't come up with the top 3 things on the spot. So I learned right off the bat that some people are happy being unhappy, and I'm not going to make them happy. And so just go with the program and stick with what you know. And another thing I learned was we were taught all this in school, and I knew it kind of, but always keep your eye on the kids, always. You never know, like if you were an administrator, you couldn't go to a classroom and ask a teacher to step out for a minute and talk to them because God only knows what would happen if you were just out for 10 seconds. And so one day, one of the administrators did this, called a teacher, and I happened to be down on the first floor, and at Rosary we had a courtyard there. The courtyard in a way was pretty nice. The only problem was it was full of these fruit trees, so there was a lot of bees in the fall, always stinging the kids. No air conditioning, so school's full of bees, stinging kids. But it looked nice, but I happened to be walking by this first floor classroom, and I see a kid jumping out from the second floor window. And I learned later on what it was. The kids had bet that he wouldn't do it. Well, a high school boy, you talk about a malformed brain, and so this kid won his bet by jumping out of the tree, by jumping out of the second story window, landed on a tree, cushioned his fall, didn't get hurt a bit, got money out of the deal. Got some sort of punishment from the school, but you know, for him it was worth the price. Another teacher story, being young and zealous, a recent graduate, thought I was very smart. I had all these great ideas about how the school could be better. And I remember going up and talking to one of the teachers, and that used to be one of my jobs, go around and visit the classrooms, learn how the teachers are doing, give them some pointers. Well, I was kind of thinking, I'm 33 years old, and even though, or 34, whatever it was at the time, I'm thinking, I don't know, some of these people have been doing this for a long time. I'm supposed to give them feedback. And this one teacher, we used to go to the classroom, we have a little meeting in the office afterwards, and if I ever write a book about high school administration, it might have this title to it. This teacher told me, and she was known to be a good teacher, actually, but she said, I can see you got some new ideas and you're trying to help us be better here at the school, and you're trying to help me be better. And she said, Father, I'm going to tell you something. I'm settled and I'm satisfied. And I go, whoa. Mr. Mormon probably knows who I'm talking about, but it could be a number of people, right? But it would be, and I thought, wow, that told me a lot. I mean, just like some people they're not happy unless they're unhappy. And some people they are not going to change. And this person wasn't a bad person that you'd want to fire, but they were not going to get any better either. And so it's like, oh, okay, you just have to be smart about how you approach different people. And that here I was young and I was on fire and everything that we're doing could be better and more energized, and I could see not everybody lived in that same world. And we do have some of the teachers here on our staff that were students there at that time. So, and one of my memories also is that was the early days of computers. Those of you who are even, well, not really, I don't think anybody here is older than me, but some people from my age group will at least remember stories in the early days of computers back in the 50s, even like when they were out at McDonnell Douglas, they were as big as rooms. And then gradually they got smaller, and then gradually they got small enough you could bring them to a normal office. Well, Rosary High School was so proud we bought one of the first computers. And it wasn't quite as big as that altar, but over half the size. And it cost $10,000. And it really couldn't do very much. But it was a computer. And it was the early days. And so I, of course, learned absolutely nothing about how to use it, nor did I want to. But it was just, I'm just describing the era we lived in 40 years ago. And so there were many, as you can see, lessons, musings and lessons. So I'm giving you some musings, some lessons. Another one of the lessons was respect for your elders. And by that time, it was pretty obvious that it was going to be about the end of the era. We were getting close to the end of the era of religious in schools. Even when I started at Dominic in 1975, there were still 11 nuns there. 10 years later, they were down to 3. Rosary, 10 years before I got there, still had 25 nuns. By the time I got there, down 5. Does that sound about right, John? Yeah. So they were. Yeah. Anyway, that era was coming to an end. But those women, the church was built on their shoulders. Those women who taught in our Catholic school system in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, even up till the middle of the 20th century and a little bit beyond. But I still remember one nun there in particular. I'll say her name, John. You might remember Sister Florentia. She was a science teacher. So they were talking about back in the 40s. Nowadays, they talk about arthroscopic surgery. Well, one of the kids in the classroom had a dad who was in the early days of manufacturing this stuff. And I remember that just the way these nuns were. They were very creative and very resourceful. And she got this kid's dad to bring this stuff in and show it to the kids. It was in the early days when you could actually put surgical tools and you could put cameras in through these things. Well, nowadays we take all that for granted, but this is 40 years ago. And when I looked at this nun's resume, you know, they got 0 time off. First of all, they got paid 0, and they got like 0 time off. Every Saturday, they were in school working on another degree. And then in summertime, they were not going to Cancun or the Cayman Islands. They were in school getting another degree. Her list of things she was qualified to teach is, and I just give you that one example about arthroscopic surgery as a simple thing, but she was qualified to teach all things science all the time. And it gave me a great respect for the generation that came ahead of me, and it inspired me to try to be equally dedicated. I just grew up, the whole of my priesthood, if you heard all these stories, the whole of it has been about adapting to changing times in the church. The church is so different from when I was born and when I grew up, but I've been in administrative positions all these years, and so try to keep things working the best that we can. Yeah, alcohol challenges. Well, that's an old issue. I got a lot of alcohol stories connected with Rosary, but there's no use getting into that too much. I will say a very sobering story. I remember being that young, and when I went to California, I grew a beard because I knew I was going to come back and be in administrative positions, and I was kind of embarrassed. I was going to be in my early 30s and supervising some people in their 50s and 60s. I thought I got to do something to look a little bit older, so I grew a beard, and I kept it for 20 years till it got real gray. But when I was there, I remembered even more so 10 years earlier when I was at Dominic. Kids, if you're a young priest, those kids will tell you anything. I knew I was hearing a lot more about what was going on in their lives than their parents knew. And one day, I can still picture this girl to this day, high school sophomore, probably had just turned 16 and just got her license. And she came in as innocent as the day is long, and she said, "Father, I just need to know, is it a sin to drive your girlfriend to get an abortion?" And thought, wow. It was a very simple question, a very direct question, and So I gave a very simple and direct answer. And, but I took time to just to explain to her what that was all about and why. But she said, you know, she viewed, I'm going to help my friend. My friend needs help, and this is what she wants to do, so why shouldn't I help her? So at any rate, that was a part of the changing times I'm talking about. That was already 12 years after Roe v. Wade, and things were totally legal, and it's the era the kids were growing up in, and what we call today the big lies. The big lies a lot of people were buying, and actually even when I was in, I probably shouldn't tell too many details, but let me just say I've worked in a lot of high schools, and so that issue among high school kids is people who think that's not an issue in high schools have their head in the sand. And so it was, I'm giving you an example, it goes back 40 years ago, it was. Oh yeah, then there was one very memorable Christmas. Well, when I was at home, that was the closest I ever lived to my parents and my priesthood. My parents still lived in Jennings at the time, and I was at Rosary, so it's not very big distance. But I happened to be at home with my parents for a Christmas dinner, and we got a call from one of the teachers at Rosary, and he tracked me down to my parents. Again, this is pre-cell phone days. Tracked me down to my parents' house. I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "Well, I came up to school because we're having a family over, and I was going to borrow one of the big coffee pots we got. But when I got to the main floor, I saw water flowing down the main hall, and I thought you would want to know." Oh, okay. And so, this is, who are you going to call to come? And it was one of those years, it's probably 84, like record low temperatures. I remember that winter, there was, if you had cracks in your asphalt and the water got down in there and froze, I mean, any pipe that had never frozen before was freezing. And this was on the north side of the building, and actually the water was still on and it was running. It was so cold that it was, how cold is it? It was so cold that it froze even while it was running. And of course it burst and there's water all over the place. And I still remember I called one of my cousins who's pretty handy at fixing anything. And you're not going to get a pipe fitter out there, you're not going to get a plumber out there. And the school was flooding. And anyway, that story goes on and on. But the bottom line is that became part of my experience. If you're an administrator in a school, you handle everything from the people's most personal issues to personnel issues to maintenance issues. It's kind of all part of the package. So after that is when I moved out to Franklin County. And that is yet one more assignment where I got assigned to go to a place I had never heard of before, St. Anne in Clover Bottom. I mean, for a city boy like me, that might as well have been Mars. There was one more place I had to go to that they were, I remember I said, well, how do you get there? They go to Washington. I did kind of know where Washington was, because even when we were in high school, we used to go there for the Thanksgiving basketball tournament. But I kind of knew where it was. That was before the interstate was built. Didn't ever have much reason to go there. But they gave me directions to get to Clover Bottom through Washington, of course. And they go, well, when you get a little bit of South Washington, you're going to see this road called Y. And it says, you're going to be asking why by that time. And when you ask that, you're going to turn right and keep going for 4.5 more miles. And I remember out there, there was really no good drivers. And I was scared to death driving on country roads. I was not afraid to drive a school bus when I was 20 years old on city streets, but I was scared to death driving those country roads. Everybody used the entire road. I still remember the first time I drove from Boise to Clover Bottom took me 25 minutes. By the time I was there a while, I could do it in 10 minutes. And I drove just as bad as everybody else. It was kind of part of the country culture. It really was kind of a fun parish for me. It was a very small part of my life in terms of hours, because I was up at the high school, boards of high school almost all the time, and I was teaching graduate school at SLU. But in terms of enjoying living there, I loved it. It was 8 miles from school, got me away from there, and the people there were lovely. Really tiny parish, maybe 100 families or so, maybe 150, but everything there was handled by volunteers. You know how they clean the church? They put a little sign up on the back bulletin board, 12 months. They had the names of 12 families. Everybody took a month to clean the church. It was clean. If there was a key to that church, I didn't know where it was. Never was locked in my entire 5 years I was out there. They volunteered for everything. PSR teachers, I remember one year they told me, they go, Father, we need 2 new PSR teachers. I said, I don't even hardly know the people here. How am I going to get them? They said, we'll give you some names. If you call, they'll say yes. So it was true to their word. They gave me some names. I called them. They said yes. Positions were filled. And then somewhere along the way, the diocese was getting more like, well, we got to pay these people. And because they had a tradition of not paying people. And they told me, they said, Father, you try to pay these people, they're going to quit. And so I tried that. I said, well, we should pay them something. I tried offering a few of them money. They said, we're quitting rather than making us take the money. So that was it. I learned a lesson about volunteerism. And yeah, it was beautiful. The parish council meetings were held in my living room. My living room wasn't very big, but it had a lounge chair in it. I sat in the lounge chair. The parish council members sat around. We shot the breeze for about an hour. Parish council meeting was over. It was, and anything that needed to be done, somebody either volunteered or knew somebody they would ask to volunteer to fix it. One of my lessons out there was on fundraising. The church is a beautiful old church. It doesn't look too different from our little church here, and it needed handicap access. But of course, and I was all about trying to put that in, but the problem was it was going to change the appearance of the front of the church. And so, and then of course I knew the next problem would be, how much is it going to cost? And who's going to pay for it? And so we got in the middle of all these discussions, and I knew I had had enough experience already in raising money. I knew a way around this was, I said, how about this? How about if I go out, and it wasn't going to be a huge, but it was going to cost maybe $15,000, which was probably a big percentage of the parish budget. But I said, how about if I just go ask somebody for that $15,000 and the church doesn't have to pay a penny? Well, then all of a sudden, all their objections went away. And so they didn't have to take any of their money. And so, and then they were concerned it was going to ruin the appearance of the church. And then, so there was some moderate disturbance over wanting to put in that handicap ramp in front of the church. But then when it got in and they saw, oh, there's a way to do this where it actually blended in architecturally. Didn't really ruin a thing. And then one of my finer moments there was when one day I saw one of the people who was the loudest complainers about, you guys could probably guess who it is, but one of the loudest complainers was walking down that ramp herself. And so that was like, life is good. Life came full circle. So anyway, just a few lessons about life, and I could talk about the little country tavern that was there. That was a lesson for me. There actually were city versions of taverns like that. If you go back a couple of generations, maybe 3 generations, where whole families would go. Well, that's pretty much where our parish went. There really wasn't anything in that town besides the church and the tavern, and that was pretty much it. It wasn't even a volunteer firehouse. That was over in Washington. So that was, but it was a joy for me to serve there. But one thing I remember about the firehouse, not the firehouse, but the tavern was they had a wild game dinner there every year. I mean, this is pre-COVID days. This is pre-COVID by decades. I mean, they would just put a piece of plywood on top of the pool table. People would bring whatever they wanted, have wild game, and anybody come get what you wanted to eat. And they also had behind the bar, they had, during deer season, there were deer everywhere. I remember one day, listening to this one lady tell her story. She actually, the same lady hit 5 deer on the way home. No matter which way she turned, more deer kept coming. And so it was just, and they had a sign, here's the signs in the tavern. They had 3 signs. They were proud of the deer. So you would write on the board the deer, like how many points the deer had, if it went out, whether you shot it. One sign went those that were shot. The second sign was those that were killed by bow and arrow. The third sign was roadkill. And so that's how they kept track in the Clover Bottom Tavern. It was a friendly place. It's kind of like the Clover Bottom version of Cheers. Okay, then there's a lot more stories about that. And related, speaking of the alcohol, when maybe the final story about Clover Bottom is to give you the local understanding about what alcohol was. When they had their big picnic, they'd pull the beer truck underneath the tent. It was a huge tent. They'd pull the tent underneath there, and of course then they'd be shooting at hay bales and stuff for not too far away from there. But I can never forget to this day, on the side of the AB beer delivery truck was a big sign that said "No alcohol allowed," and that was their idea. I thought that's kind of a funny sign to put on a beer truck, but beer certainly didn't count as alcohol. It just was. It was just a necessity of life, and so. Okay, then was that. I know I'm getting near my time limit here. Well, I guess you guys can stay if you want. We still got a half hour to go, but I'm not going to use it all up. But when I went over to the high school, I remember I was excited about that. This was my first time I was ever the head person in a school. I had been assistant persons before, but going there, and I remember one of my first years there, I did one very unpopular thing. I attempted with the seniors to stop hazing. I thought Borgia was a beautiful community, but I thought it was backwards in some of those ways. It was stuff that they were proud of back in the old school days. Well, when it was going to be my watch, things were going to change. And I still, like, they used to do the stuff about, like, having seniors and make freshmen push pennies on the ground with their noses and stuff like that. And I don't know, I just didn't see that as part of helping us be a better Catholic school. And what really helped in the end was, I still remember there was one of the local schools was called the Pacific Indians. And I remember that a big tradition in the school was to have a bonfire every year at the beginning of the football season. And they took an Indian mannequin and threw it on the bonfire. And we had one of the teachers there had a background, had a family member who was Indian from South America. And I was sorry to see that happen, but I was glad because it brought that practice to an end. And it helped give me some support for getting rid of other kind of hazing in the school. So some of the kids still didn't like me about that till this day, but it didn't matter to me. It taught me early on, you're just going to have to do certain things if you're going to change the culture. Yeah, because the culture there, school had a lovely tradition, but it was a little casual in some ways. In terms of what the kids would do during the school day, and we're coming upon a new era. So I just learned you just have to do what you have to do. And some of the kids did the usual kind of things, like I remember one of the first graduation classes I had. You know how the kids maybe you don't familiar, because I've given out thousands of diplomas in my life, is what I'm used to doing. And a pretty common practice is when you hand the kid the diploma with your left hand, shake with your right hand, they'll put a marble in your hand or a penny in your hand, let it drop on the floor, make a big noise, whatever. Only one time did a kid ever have a buzzer in his hand, and he came up. And so I was pretty well used to this, so I shook his hand with the buzzer, and supposed to hand a diploma with the left hand, shake with the right. I shook with the right, gave him a big smile for the picture, took the diploma back. I just said, "Do you want that diploma? Then you can just come see me after the ceremony's over, and we'll talk about it." And so I just learned there's part of that what I said before about clear boundaries and clear and consistent enforcement. So that was, yeah. But actually, that student and I are actually very good friends nowadays. So, but I will just say, I didn't even mind it. I actually liked the part of being an administrator where the students thought they knew more about running the school than I did. I thought, when I was 18 years old, I thought I knew more than just about any adult. So I didn't really think ill of that. I remember one time that we had a kid who was a lead in a play, but you had to have your grades to a certain level to continue to be in the play. And this kid did not. So the kid was not suspended from school, but was deprived of the activities. So this is like the week before the play. And what's the name of that musical that goes Somewhere There's a Place for Us? It's West Side Story. And so that was the musical that year, West Side Story, and the kids were so mad at me they stood outside my office and sang Somewhere There's a Place for Us. And I thought it was pretty cute, you know. Did it change my mind? No. Those of you who know me know it's like, well, kids, you know, I kind of handed it to them. Because back in the 60s and 70s, people were burning down buildings and stuff. So standing outside the room singing Somewhere There's a Place for Us was like pretty cool. And I gave them a lot of credit for having being a little spine. And during that whole time I was there, I was teaching at SLU also, like I did that for probably 20 years. In fact, I was proud of that fact. It's one of the things that, just as I said before about Monsignor Pelker, some of the parishioners there at Good Counsel were people he had as kids in his youth group when he was back at the Italian parish. Well, it got to be that way with me, where some of the people that I taught at SLU getting graduate degrees in school administration, 2 of them later on became administrators there. And all over the diocese. So it was a way that I kind of had my hand in a lot of things. Borgia community was a lot like Clover Bottom in the sense of having volunteers were a big deal there. I remember the first summer I was there, they put in a new set of bleachers by the football field. And in order to save about $75,000, they decided to install them themselves rather than pay the company to install them. Well, all it took to install those bleachers to save $75,000 was about 6 cases of beer a night, and that took care of it. So you could buy a lot of 6 cases of beer for $75,000, and the guys were happy doing it, and I got to meet a lot of them that way. And as most of you know, I couldn't build a doghouse, but I could take a nut, put it on a boat, and that's about all you had to do. And I was clever enough, I could even tighten it up. But that was about the extent of my mechanical abilities. But that's all we had to do to put it together, and I got to meet a lot of people that summer, so had a good time doing that. And then on more serious matters, we were there when I got there. That school didn't have a pot to pee in. We didn't have enough money to pay the teachers the second month I was going to be there. And I was left a note by the previous administrator. It said, if you have trouble with money, call this bank and they'll loan you some. I thought, well, it's kind of like I felt when I got lower down the key in my previous place where I went. It's like, well, welcome. We don't know how you're going to pay the people, but hope you enjoy it. So I did. There's no use going into details, but it came up with a scheme that first summer I was there. I spent a lot of that first summer burning up the airways from Clover Bottom, calling people saying, hey, need a little help. And so it worked out. We ended up being able to pay them, and when I talked about the joys and sorrows of administration, it did get to the point where things didn't turn the corner. We were surviving. It was pretty much a brand new school at the time. It was only 4 years old, and it's a new school building. It was an old school history. The parish school went back over 50 years, but we had enough troubles there one year where we had to freeze the wages of the teachers. And I still remember one of the teachers came up to me one day. So here I am in my mid-30s, all expired and fired up about trying to raise the bar on everything from the Catholic faith to getting rid of hazing to raising the academic standards, and we didn't have any money. And so you can imagine that was not an exciting day for the teachers when we froze the wages. And so I won't forget ever when a teacher comes up to me and says, you know, I've been at this school for decades, and the morale has never been lower here. So you can't you know, there's no way you can hide behind anything there. It was a bad feeling, and I was the head guy, and so it didn't kill me. It just felt bad, but it was a lesson. It was like it just made me work harder, to try to leave the school on solid ground when I left. So that was my goal, was that by the time I left, it would be in better shape than when I got there. And so there's no use going into all those details, but it did eventually get better. But when I threw that in here about when I called it the joys and sorrows of administration. I'm telling a lot of funny stories tonight. There are a lot of funny things that happen, and it's way better to laugh than to cry. But it's not like it was easy, and it taught me lessons. I mean, some of the very, very fundamental lessons in administration is, I mean, it's so trite that you almost hate to say it out loud, but it's always just do the right thing. If you consult with people, and no matter what happens, if you think about it, study about it, consult about it, pray about it, do the right thing. You can't really be too worried about whether people like you or whether they get upset if you're convinced it's the right way to go. Okay, so a few things I wrote down is, and again, I'm only saying about half of what I have written down, but the bottom line beneath all that was then, I've said this, many of you were at my previous talks, it's always about being mission driven. Keeping your eye on the goal. Keep your eye on the goal. The mission is to help form people to be good Catholics, to help them get to use all their human gifts, to help them become the people God wants them to be, all for the glory of God. So that was any decision I made, whether it was about money or personnel or policies in the school, was all about that. And so that was, I had all the energy in the world for that. And so I tried to pass that on to the next generations. So I think one of the lessons is just what a blessing for our archdiocese is the rich high school traditions we had. We had, and that's what the next chapter is going to be on when I went into the superintendent's office. But yeah, we had 31 Catholic high schools here, and that had to do with a lot of people having a lot of foresight. Even back in the 80s and 90s, we were having, in our diocese, we had about 40% of all Catholic kids in Catholic high schools. That was unheard of around the country. The average around the country was like 10%. And our average enrollment in elementary schools was about 70% of the available Catholic kids. The average around the country was about 30%. So people, even to this day, are beneficiaries of that rich tradition. And those of you who know me from this parish know that's one of the reasons I'm so dedicated to keeping this school as strong as it can be on all those levels. The faith level, the academic level, the financial level, keep it stable, because I view it as a person in my age, old as I am, but I'm helping what I would say preserve the rich traditions that I inherited from other people. There's no time to talk about it tonight, but also during these years, you know, I was I said parts of this in some other talks earlier. Because of the education background I had and people that I met, I had numerous chances to travel around the world giving talks about education and spirituality. And so that part of my life really enriched my life and gave me perspective. One of my main takeaways from all the different countries I was in, especially all the different third world countries, I remember when I would come home and walk down a food aisle at any one of our food stores, I would almost start crying. When I would see what the variety we have available to us 12 months out of the year, and how many people in the world. I wasn't in any places where people were starving to death, but I was in a lot of places where they really only had one thing to eat, whatever was growing at the time. And so just to see that, it gave me, all those experiences gave me more appreciation for the comfortable lives we have here. I've said this in every talk. Some of the themes are common in every chapter of my life. One is obedience. Go where the bishop sends me. Don't wait for him to send me where I'm going to be happy, but be happy wherever he sends me. That's worked for the last 50 years. So it's still working here. I've kind of made my own fun wherever I've been, despite whatever the challenges are. Another thing is the fundamental philosophical difference. It's one thing to learn this in philosophy class. It's another to live it out. They call it the difference between the is and the ought. This is the way the world ought to be, but if you're an administrator, you don't deal with the way the world ought to be, you deal with the way the world is, and make your best decisions possible. And one of the lessons I learned early on, getting into legal things, I still remember the first time the school got sued because some kid got hurt, and this parent didn't have a leg to stand on as far as I was concerned with their case. And so I got so mad at our lawyers and at our insurance company when they agreed to settle out of court. Most of you know the way the world works. That's the way that it is. When I was told, well, it's going to cost us more to prove that we're right than it is to just pay them money in the first place, I couldn't stand it, especially when I knew how hard I had worked to get us out of the red into the black. But there's a difference between the is and the ought. And so there's almost all of administration is like that. Well, this is the way I'd like things to be. This would be a great world if, well, you know, it's like a pig's had wings, they could fly. Well, you deal with the world the way that it is and do your best. I mean, it's what Jesus had to do. Think about even the apostles he picked. He probably could have picked better people, but he didn't. He picked the ones he picked, and he did his best with the ones that he had. That's kind of the way administration is. You do your best with whatever's in front of you. Another thing I learned is there's no shortcuts. If you have a plan to deal with a certain situation, whatever it is, a policy, a personnel matter, a discipline matter, whatever it is, don't skip steps. Do your research. Make hard decisions. Be willing to be unpopular, but make sure that you know more about it than the person who you're going to be talking to. Do not skip steps. If you skip steps, you pay the price in the long run. Yeah, that pertains to every aspect of administration. Another lesson I learned, going back to the story I told before about Sister Florentia, worship the local shrines is what I call it. When you get into a new situation, figure out who's the people around that everybody else respects the most, and show a lot of respect to those people. You may not like them, you may not agree with them, but if they're highly appreciated in that community, it's going to be in your best interest. Show appreciation for them as well. Doesn't mean you need to agree with them all the time, but it means to show proper respect. And that was true. Sister Florentia would have been one of those people. And even when I was at Borgia, there were certain people who had been on staff for decades. And it was a good thing for me to learn about that and to show proper respect for them. If I respected the people that they respected, it's going to be more likely they're going to pay attention to me. And that's true in many facets of life. In terms of, another thing is kind of like do the right thing, facing nothing. Again, it's a truism, almost not worth saying, but face the truth. There's hardly been anywhere I've been where there wasn't somebody with their hand in the till. And that's a difficult thing to face up to when it happens. But as a head person, it's my job to be a good steward of whatever the resources the institution has. And it seems that very often when somebody is caught with their hand in the till, it's a person who actually is doing a lot of good, and sometimes a person who's very popular. Well, that happened when I was out there. But no matter what the person's personal situation is, what's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. And again, it's worked for me for 50 years, just be mission driven. What's important to the mission of that school? What's important to the mission of the school is our faith, integrity, truth, dedication, loyalty, all those virtues. Anytime a leader compromises on those virtues, things are going to go downhill. And so it's another time an administrator can become unpopular when you deal with a person who's in a responsible position and they're very well respected, but sometimes they just need to be challenged. And so I was up to it. And then, the final remark I have for tonight is, in terms of a lesson, is a simple one that I naturally, when I finished getting my doctorate, I thought I was ready to come back and pretty much not only run the school system, but run the archdiocese. And so, just like I said, I was in the earlier talk, I was very grateful for those first 4 years of my priesthood I had at Cottleville. But even though I was teaching at the time too, but it's the only 4 years of my 50 years as a priest where I wasn't in charge of something. And so I have, not that there's anything wrong with being the head person, but those years taught me a lot about life, and I learned a lot from the people. They showed me what people want out of a good priest. And so those lessons were very valuable for every aspect of my priesthood to this day. And every aspect of being a good administrator is knowing what it's like to be the boots on the ground person. And then similarly, for all these I'm glad I had these 7 years of experiences working in these 3 different high schools, in Kennedy, at Rosary, at Borgia, because I think all the experiences I had there helped prepare me for all the other responsibilities I've had since. So grateful. Again, it kind of goes back to the thing about obedience. Me being obedient to the bishop and going places I never heard of or never wanted to go, I think has been beneficial for me personally, and I think beneficial for all the places I've served. So thank you for not getting up and leaving, paying attention. God bless you. Does anybody who's here, who knows me from those years, want to make any rebuttals or any comments? Or tell any stories? We advertise this as a 90-minute program. We're 12 minutes short of that, so if somebody wants to say something. Okay. If not, what we'll do is we'll just go out to the gathering space there and we can visit for a few minutes. So thank you. If you're interested for more, the next talk is a week from tomorrow.